Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Here on Bloomberg TV and radio, live on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals as well. Thanks for joining us. As we look for the way forward here when it comes to Iran, along with a couple of other issues, but this is the story we're going to stick with as an important meeting gets underway today in Geneva with Iran's foreign minister and what we're now calling the E3, the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany, all after yesterday's revelation by President Trump that we now have 2 weeks of breathing room to find a diplomatic solution. There were questions when we last spoke on Wednesday, of course, about whether a U.S. strike against Iran was imminent. We heard from the White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt yesterday on this. 2 weeks it is.
If the U.S. were to take some type of military action, would the president go to Congress to seek war authority?
I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals. I gave you the statement from the president. He'll make a decision within 2 weeks.
Simple as that, as we bring in Nick Wadhams on the conversation, who leads our national security team here in Washington. Nick, it's great to see you. This has been a pretty interesting process, and now we've got a meeting underway with the chance for a diplomatic solution. It's unclear what exactly motivated President Trump to allow for the 2 weeks, but when you hear from Iran's foreign minister actually making tracks to Geneva, what does that tell us?
It could tell us a lot or it could tell us nothing. I mean, I think the thing that's really interesting from the Karoline Leavitt statement is she says within 2 weeks. And it's like, well, if you start to actually parse that, it's like, well, what does that mean? I mean, the interpretation had been, okay, they're giving us a 2 week reprieve. But then she's saying within, which means it really could happen at any time. Okay. So it does give the president a little breathing room because there had been, as we and many others have reported, the conventional wisdom was that these strikes were going to happen this weekend. Mm-hmm. And a lot of anticipation for that. She now seems to be broadening out the time horizon. What does seem clear is the president has not made a final decision. But the issue of the Iranian foreign minister meeting the Europeans, in some ways, I see that as almost as like a last ditch effort. But the president has been very dismissive of European efforts in large part. He really wants this to be a U.S.-Iran conversation. So it's not clear to me what Iran could say in that meeting that would persuade him to hold off.
So he may not find that a deal with the Europeans is credible. To begin with, you just left them in Canada to think about it. You were there, as a matter of fact. But interesting to hear from the UK Foreign Minister David Lammy on X. He wrote, "The situation in the Middle East remains perilous." And this is following a meeting with Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff. He writes, "We're determined that Iran must never have a nuclear weapon." Meeting with Rubio and Witkoff at the White House today, we discussed how a deal could avoid a deepening conflict. A window now exists within the next 2 weeks to achieve a diplomatic solution. Is it his job to express that kind of optimism, or was there a feeling in the room that we might have avoided a war?
I think what you're seeing here is officials from everywhere, whether it's the U.S. and non-officials like Steve Bannon or Tucker Carlson and now the U.K. and others, basically trying to triangulate and get messages to Trump. I mean, whenever we talk to people about, well, what is he going to do? Will he, won't he? The response is always, it really depends on who the last person was he spoke to. So this is the sort of infamous or famous way that Trump does business. He has a lot of ideas, but then it often comes down to who got to him last. So I think what you're seeing from the UK there is in some ways the government in the UK has tried to play the role of not necessarily peacemaker, but hey, let's take a breath here. Keir Starmer, the prime minister, said a couple days ago he believed the president was not going to attack. Now you have this nascent effort by the Europeans. Okay, let's just take a breath. Let's have this little window. Let's see if we can get something done. But the president himself has said, essentially that it was too late. Iran had 60 days, and that's what led to this Israeli strike. Counter that against the idea of him as the deal maker. There's no one who wants a deal more than Donald Trump wants a deal. He would love to get a deal here. The question is there anything that Iran can say now that is going to satisfy him and make him say, okay, I mean, a meeting with the Europeans right now, I'm not really sure what Iran could do short of saying, okay, we are going to give up all of our aspirations for a nuclear, which, they're probably not going to do.
Okay, so we have 2 weeks. The conventional wisdom on Wednesday was you need B-2 bombers with these MOP bombs to get to Fordow and the sensitive enrichment facility under a mountain in Israel. Now there's this idea, well, what if Benjamin Netanyahu has 2 weeks and he might actually send special forces inside that complex? Donald Trump doesn't need to put Americans in harm's way. Is he allowing for that possibility?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can imagine what the conversations look like in the White House as the president says, okay, what are my options? What's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? I mean, yes, they have air dominance, but there is still a potential risk that a U.S. plane could get shot down. U.S. service members' lives could be lost. Obviously, the question of, okay, if you do this strike from this bomb, we believe it would have a devastating impact. It might not have a devastating impact. We don't know. This weapon is largely unproven in a situation like this. So no guarantee that it would have the effect the U.S. wants it to have. Suddenly the administration is pulled deeper into this conflict. What if then U.S. bases are attacked? So he's getting advice from a lot of folks who say, oh yeah, just go in, drop the 30,000-pound bomb, done, dusted, we're good to go, American involvement over. Yeah. He's also presumably getting a lot of information from folks who say high risk, potentially low reward. And then the Israelis have said publicly, we have plenty of options here. You know, there are other ways of doing this, special forces being one of them. So obviously difficult to get inside the president's head, but you can be sure he's getting a lot of very different information.
A lot of worries about the day after, as they call it.
Day after,
what would Iran do to strike back, forcing continued U.S. involvement? Or what would happen if an American aircrew were shot down?
And it goes against everything the president campaigned on. I mean, yes, peace through strength, that's a big one. But, you know, he billed himself as the peace president. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of times I sat through campaign rallies and also conversations with his advisors. No new wars in the first term. Suddenly the president is potentially going to war with Iran. I mean, that's really going to undercut the message he has sent and a lot of the support he gets from the MAGA base.
Yeah, it's not lost on us that Steve Bannon had lunch at the White House yesterday. Nick, great to see you. Nick Wadhams, Bloomberg's national security team leader, with us here in Washington. As we read the tea leaves with 2 weeks out, or maybe less, as Nick identified, the language here, the semantics are important. Within 2 weeks is what the press secretary said. We had the voice of experience in Dan Kurtzer, now with Princeton University, where he's professor of Middle East policy. He's former U.S. ambassador to Israel and has been in the room for talks like the ones we're describing today in Geneva. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. Do you share the optimism of the UK foreign minister when it comes to these talks today in Geneva?
Well, there's no basis to be optimistic unless they've heard something from the Iranians that they'll communicate to the president. What they need to hear, and what the president would need to hear, is that the Iranians are ready to come back to the talks and understand that they will have to give up enrichment on Iranian soil. If the Europeans can produce that kind of a commitment, then the president can talk to Netanyahu about holding up a little bit and giving diplomacy a chance. But otherwise, aspirations are nice, but we're really far down the road beyond simply hope.
Well, you hear the phrase unfettered access, and it brings you back to the nuclear deal with Iran and to years long before that, and even to Iraq. You remember how this goes with weapons inspectors, and it's typically not to meet expectations. With Iran, they've turned back on a number of promises before. Why would this time be any different?
Well, the reality is that in 2015, with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, for 3 years, the Iranians adhered to that agreement. And each time a small violation was uncovered, it was fixed right away. So there is at least a small track record of Iranian compliance, which of course ended when the United States pulled out of the JCPOA. Now, I think that we would need a much stronger JCPOA 2.0. We'd have to have no end date. You remember the JCPOA was supposed to come to an end within 12 to 15 years. So no end date, better assurances with regard to the reconstitution of the program. But a tougher agreement could lead to Iranian compliance, an end of the war, and therefore an end of the Iranian nuclear program.
Is Iran more or less likely to agree to stop enriching uranium as it is being bombed by Israel? Is this maximum pressure campaign the type of thing that works in this scenario, or moves Iran further away from an agreement like that?
Well, it's a great question, and the answer is unknown. Before the Israeli bombing, Iran was stuck on the idea that it would not give up the right to enrich uranium. So we don't know whether the debilitation of Iran's military capabilities, its missile program, and its nuclear program will now make a convincing argument otherwise. I think much of this is going to depend on what's happening within the opaque system in Tehran. The Ayatollah still is calling the shots, but there are quite a few different factions playing in this, including more extreme elements in the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the so-called Basij, who have argued for years that Iran should simply develop a nuclear weapon. So they will be pressing for that. Others might say, look, we invested a lot, we lost a lot, we have no allies in the region, and it's time to give it up.
There's been some interesting reporting on U.S. intelligence estimates when it comes to Iran's ability to and motivation to make a nuclear weapon. We are frequently not on the same page as Israel when it comes to this, Ambassador, and I wonder your thoughts about the assessment we're reading about today that Iran has yet to decide whether to make a nuclear bomb, even though it does in fact have a large stockpile of enriched uranium. The idea is that it would be more likely to shift toward producing a bomb if the U.S. decides to get involved offensively with Israel. Do you believe that to be true?
Well, our intelligence community has been consistent since 2003 in saying that Iran is not trying to weaponize the capability of using a nuclear weapon. And that was something that Tulsi Gabbard back in, I guess it was March, April, testified to Congress. And it's something that the president simply said he didn't agree with, even though it's his intelligence people telling him that. So you have to distinguish between the weaponization program, which appears not to be in place, as opposed to the preparatory steps that Iran has been taking and accelerating since 2018, since we pulled out of the JCPOA, and they started enriching at a much higher level, up to 60%. And there's some indication that at least at one point they went beyond 60%. Which would bring them very, very close to being a threshold nuclear state with a breakout time that's essentially days, not even weeks. So they're prepared, I think, to move expeditiously. Their capabilities are much less today as a result of Israeli bombing. Question is, how do you make sure that what Israel accomplished militarily is sustainable and that Iran cannot reconstitute its program?
So, Ambassador, what do you expect to take place then in the next 2 weeks? And if the U.S. managed to strike a deal with Iran, would Israel trust it?
Well, what I expect to take place is a lot of back-channel conversations. We know that the president's envoy, Stephen Witkoff, has tried to reach out to the Iranians. We now have this European meeting. There's going to be a lot of chatter behind the scenes. And I think the president will factor that into the equation. Are the Iranians really ready as a result of having been bruised? Are they really ready to come to the table and give up enrichment, which would make a JCPOA 2.0 possible? Whether Netanyahu would be satisfied with that? Look, as far as the Israelis are concerned, unless Fordow is taken out, the heavily fortified underground facility, they think their job won't be done. As Nick suggested, there may be other ways of doing it besides simply B-2 bombing. You knock out the electricity, the entrances, the air supply, and you keep at it for a while. So you're going to see, I think, in these 2 weeks, back-channel contacts, sustained Israeli attacks, including against Fordow, And within that 2-week period, whether the president can put this all together in a diplomatic package is literally anyone's guess at this point.
Wow. Wouldn't want to be a worker at Fordo right now. Ambassador, we just ran a headline across the terminal. The Iran-European nuclear talks in Geneva have come to an end. We are standing by for a statement as we wait for a readout. And in our final moment here together, Ambassador, where's Russia and China on this? Or are we learning right now that they have no influence on what's happening?
Well, they certainly have little influence. The Chinese are heavily dependent on Iran's oil and gas, and therefore they're concerned whether this war escalates and whether attacks against the energy infrastructure take place, or whether Iran, in response, blocks the Straits of Hormuz. So the Chinese are nervous. The Russians are incapacitated because of their own war. But nonetheless, it would behoove the president to think about including them in any multilateral diplomatic approach. After all, it was the Russians, Chinese, and the 3 Europeans who joined us in 2015 to make the JCPOA work at that time. So they're not going to be major players in this, but they'll be important players if Iran sees that not just the Europeans and the Americans, but also their friends in Moscow and Beijing are telling them it's time to call it quits.
Great to have you with us, sir. Dan Kurtzer, former U.S. ambassador to Israel, now at Princeton, with us here on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Thank you for joining on the Friday edition. It feels strangely like a Monday if you had the thing off yesterday. Of course, that was Juneteenth at the White House. Not acknowledged. In fact, a very strange post by President Trump on Juneteenth, instead of putting out a proclamation on the holiday as might be considered normal for an administration, Juneteenth went unmarked by the president. As the New York Times writes, the president brought it to Truth Social. Quote, soon we'll end up having a holiday for every once working day of the year. Strange grammar. It must change if we're going to make America great again, suggesting that we get rid of, quote, non-working holidays, unquote. It does make you wonder if Juneteenth, which of course is a federal holiday, markets were closed yesterday, will survive this second Trump administration. The matter of immigration policy in this White House is, of course, a massive story right now. And we had a very important court ruling that you may not have been paying attention to yesterday. You should know about it. Remember, just a couple of weeks ago, before we thought we were on the cusp of war with Iran, we were talking about violence in the streets of L.A., the deployment of National Guard troops by the president around the back of Governor Gavin Newsom. This, of course, has been tied up in court. Active duty Marines were later deployed to federal property in L.A., and a federal appeals court has unanimously ruled that Donald Trump is allowed to retain control of the National Guard in California against the challenge from the governor. On social media, Donald Trump looking to the horizon. Again, Truth Social hailing the decision as a big win, suggesting it would open the door for other such deployments across the United States if law enforcement were unable, for whatever reason, he writes, to get the job done. It's where we start with our political panel today. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, and partner at Stone Court Capital. And joined today by Matt Bennett, I'm glad to say, Democratic strategist and Executive Vice President, Public Affairs at Third Way. Gentlemen, great to see you. Happy Friday, and thanks for joining us. Rick, are we going to start seeing examples like this in other cities around the country now?
You know, look, I mean, I think that Donald Trump is going to use the power that the Constitution gives him. And nobody debated prior to this instance in California that he didn't have the right to call up the National Guard. Of course, we talked about that ad nauseum after the attack on the Capitol. And why didn't Donald Trump call up the National Guard? I mean, if it was up to the state, the governor of Maryland would have done it. But the reality is it's almost like the administration wants to provoke a fight, right? And they're targeting blue states to bring the heat of ICE, of Homeland Security, to these deportation initiatives. And so they're going right into the mouth of the beast. Sanctuary states, sanctuary cities, they know they're going to get this pushback, but they also are under enormous pressure to drive deportation. So, it's a cauldron of heat. And in the summertime, heat tends to turn into fire.
Boy, how true. Well put, Rick. It is going to be 100 degrees next week, Matt Bennett. So if you're J.B. Pritzker, if you're Kathy Hochul, if you're Governor Shapiro, what should you be bracing for?
It's not at all clear. I mean, Rick is certainly right, and I think the court probably got it right. They don't like to get involved in the president's duties as commander-in-chief, and his ability to call up the National Guard is clear, but it is also worth noting that this was the first time a president had called out the Guard without the support of the governor of that state since the civil rights era in the 50s. So it's been a while since anyone's done that. And as Rick noted, if he had done it as governors and the mayor were asking him to on January 6th, that would have been with the very strong support of the commanders of those National Guard troops. So will this happen in other places? I think that the White House certainly is spoiling for a fight. They think this is working for them. All of the quotes you saw in the stories about this from White House aides said they thought politically it was good to have the president fighting with the governor of a blue state over immigration enforcement. But I also think it's important to kind of disentangle these two things. This wasn't about immigration enforcement. This was about putting down violent protests, which I think the governor was correct. The 9,000 police officers in Los Angeles were ready to do without the National Guard.
Interesting. Having thought about what Matt just said, Rick, J.D. Vance is reportedly preparing for a trip to Los Angeles this week. This administration is clearly not done trying to seize on the optics around all of this. What's going to come from this trip? And if you were advising this administration as a political operative, what would you be staging for him in L.A.?
Well, it's like what we were talking about a minute ago, Joe. They want to provoke, right? I mean, like in most administrations, they'd look at this and say, hey, let's wait till things simmer down before we go, for whatever reason they want to go. Not this administration. J.D. Vance is going there. He's going to meet with the people on the ground who are doing deportations, who are imposing law and order on these immigration protests. I mean, like he's going to go right in and throw some punches. And it's part of this ongoing campaign, not just to engage Governor Newsom and, sort of take a political stand against his leadership, but also to try to, basically change the tide, a national consensus in states like California and, as you said, Illinois and Massachusetts and others, that these are sanctuary states and we're not going to put up with it and you're going to have to change. And that change will not come soon. This is going to be a fight that'll take a long time. And it's instructive to all of us to understand that this administration is a provocateur, right? They want to cause a fight. Yes. They're not looking for things to settle down. Those troops are there because they have riots, and their view is those troops are going to stay as long as there are riots, and we're going to not do anything to take the foot off the pedal when it comes to provoking those protesters. So I think we're in for a difficult summer. I don't think this is going to be the only state that has these kind of issues. And it's almost like J.D. Vance has been given the mandate to go out and support what Homeland Security is doing, what ICE is doing, and show this administration is not backing down.
That's going to be a moment when you see him. Maybe he'll go to Dodgers Stadium, Matt Bennett. If you see what happened there yesterday, quite remarkable. The team blocked federal immigration agents from accessing Dodger Stadium parking lots yesterday. Now imagine a bunch of pickup trucks roll up and you've got guys with masks on, no uniforms, no visible badges. They're wearing street clothes and they look scary. Immigration and Customs Enforcement denied having agents at the stadium. Department of Homeland Security acknowledging that Customs and Border Protection vehicles were present. If you're with us on YouTube, you see the back and forth on X. Dodgers wrote this morning, ICE agents came to the stadium and requested permission to access the parking lots. They were denied entry. Tonight's game will be played as scheduled. Homeland said the incident, quote, had nothing to do with the Dodgers. Said that their vehicles were in stadium parking lots very briefly, unrelated to any operation or enforcement. ICE called the statement from the Dodgers false. We were never there. I'm really confused. And I don't know what people think was going on. At one point, a reporter went up to the ICE agent or these unmarked agents and said, "Who are you?" They said DHS and would not identify themselves. Did the Dodgers just become an example of something here? Matt, what do you take from this?
The whole thing is so weird. I mean, how do you wander into a giant stadium parking lot unintentionally? None of it makes any sense. The answer is we don't know. The Dodgers happen to own a huge piece of property, and they, as property owners, had the right to kick those guys out. But I think the bigger thing is the thing you flagged, which is the way they're going about immigration enforcement is really scary. They are not, in many cases, not in uniform. They do not identify themselves. They are wearing masks. They're heavily armed. They're grabbing people off the streets, in some cases in front of their children. This is not the way law enforcement is supposed to work in the United States. Law enforcement is supposed to be clearly designated by their uniforms. They're supposed to tell you who they are and what they're doing and where they're taking the people that they're taking. So this feels very un-American and very authoritarian. And that's in part the thing that I think a lot of Democrats are responding to. And by the way, while the Trump enforcement efforts are broadly popular, that kind of thing, the militarization and the no markings and the thuggery, that's not popular.
Well, the team's getting some pressure to do something here. There is an expectation the teams, and if maybe they have already, were to announce plans to assist immigrant communities. They don't want to be in the middle of all of this. They're trying to sell tickets to games. Rick, what do you make of this, though? I mean, if you see these guys roll into a parking lot, they could be the Proud Boys for crying out loud. They've got a pickup truck. You don't see a badge. To what extent is all of this legal and effective?
Yeah, well, I think, the courts are going to tell us ultimately what's legal. I think there's a lot of extracurricular activity going on around the country with these kinds of sort of pseudo-militant groups who have decided to take this on for themselves. There have been already examples of non-law enforcement, non-federal agents getting into the act of rolling up people they assume are undocumented and don't seem to be trying very hard to identify those people in the time they harass them. So look, we're in a tough environment, and Matt's right. I mean, like, we are all about law enforcement. We want law enforcement to work in this country. We are a country of laws. That's why our cars for cops are painted explicitly with the identifications that they have. That's why uniforms are a must with our agents. Sure, there are undercover people working to preserve law and order in our country, but not in the context of rolling up folks for deportation in, black minivans with no markings on them. This is not the United States. And if there's one thing I know about the American public, and it's reinforced over and over and over again in all the survey data, is we are a country of fairness. We want a fair fight. We want a fair chance. And when we see those tables being turned to the point where there is unfair activity occurring in these jurisdictions as it relates to these kinds of things, families are being treated poorly, they will react negatively. And at the end of the day, the biggest check on power in the United States is with voters. And the president is playing with fire if he doesn't think these kinds of tactics aren't going to be punished come midterm elections. And we all watch the House of Representatives being so close. 3 members alone will flip the power. But there are a lot of senators I know from Republican states who are starting to worry about what impact all this is going to have on their reelections.
Wow. Really smart analysis from both Rick Davis and Matt Bennett. A great panel and a great conversation. Remembering, of course, Donald Trump doesn't want masks on protesters. And there are a lot of questions right now about why there are masks on law enforcement, particularly when they're not identifying themselves.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts. or watch us live on YouTube.
Well, there's not a lot going on in town today. We're waiting to hear from the president on Iran. You've got the House on recess. It's pretty quiet in the nation's capital. There's some important work that's kicking off here in the United States Senate. You hear us talk about the bird bath, the bird droppings, the things that might not end up in the bill. It's getting going now on the Senate Finance Committee's portion of the president's big, beautiful bill. This is the tough stuff in many cases, the controversial tax-related stuff, the Medicaid situation. And we're going to get into it now with somebody who's been on the other side of the bird bath. With our eyes on the Senate, we bring in from the House, Patrick McHenry. Of course, former chair, House Financial Services Committee, former Speaker Pro Temp, Bloomberg contributor. Nice to see you.
Honored to be back.
It's like just me and you in the Capitol today.
This is fantastic.
Quiet
this
around
is like
here.
the place to ourselves.
Well, yeah, and thank you for being here. So there are questions about what's going to make the cut. I'm going to play you Mike Lawler in a minute because he talked to us on Wednesday about holding the line on salt. There's a lot of stuff up in the air here. The parliamentarian will then have a say. Is there anything beginning with the current policy baseline that could be massively disrupted this weekend?
Well, I think the current policy baseline is the big enchilada, and the major decision, and there'll be a waterfall off of that.
Okay.
So we're going through a set of procedures that every House member hates. So we send over a bill that we think conforms with reconciliation, the law that governs the reconciliation process. Mm-hmm. It really doesn't have any bearing on the House because we work as a majoritarian institution on a daily, weekly basis. That's what we do. Yeah. Or they do now, I should say. And then in the Senate, it's complex because you have this cloture threshold. You have these higher standards to do anything. Mm-hmm. The one example of them having a 50+1 margin for policy that affects budgeting occurs through the reconciliation process. The Senate procedure here puts the power to make that decision the parliamentarian, and with only very rare historic moments has the parliamentarian been overruled.
Aaron McDonough, is that if I remember? Is this a very unpopular person?
Highly unpopular.
Someone you see in the elevator?
Highly unpopular, but also the most popular.
And
right?
most powerful.
Most powerful. So this whole process
hasn't paid for a drink in years.
No, and this process is one that is deeply adjudicated, and the attempt here is to be balanced. Mm-hmm. Balanced over the 10 and 20 and 30-year basis, not just the 2-year Congress basis. Yeah. So a lot will be pulled out of this bill, like it always is in every reconciliation package that has happened over the last 20 years.
How predictable is that typically?
It is not predictable.
Okay.
It is not predictable because there are a lot of performative acts going in, a lot of bravado of what the policymaker or those that oppose the policy think is the right outcome, which is obviously their perspective, not anything connected with the rules. It's their whims, their wishes. So what comes out of this is less of a bill than started. That is historic. That is natural for this process. And it will be more frustrating to House members what falls out than what stays in. Which is why you're seeing House members opine about every step of the way, as they should.
So current policy baseline gut check, the Senate knows this is coming. Surely they've been in touch. That would really disrupt this bill. Does it stay in?
I think it stays in.
Okay.
I think it stays in. But these things are very hard to predict. But I think on balance, I think it stays in. That also changes the score for certain policymakers. It doesn't change the score for Wall Street. Wall Street looks at this and says Republicans haven't done enough to reduce the debt and deficit. Haven't turned the tide on our annual deficits. Haven't done anything to address the national debt. And that is problematic. This is a bill that is by and large a tax extension of current code. When you take that out, the deficit reduction package is a very serious one. It's not as large as the debt reduction package we had 2 years ago under divided government. It's not as large as the divided government debt reduction or deficit reduction package we had under President Obama with Republican leadership in the House. So it is large. It is not a standout in historic terms. The larger ones were done in a large bipartisan package.
When you consider deal breakers here, next in line might be SALT, which is amazing to me that it's come to this. But there was a deal, of course, in the House. If you watch or listen to Bloomberg, you already know it's a big story around here, $40,000. It came out of the Ways and Means Committee at 30. A lot of people thought maybe that's where this would settle down. Senate kicks it back at 10. You know, we don't know anything about SALT on the Senate side.
The Senate cares not
at all.
Whit.
And we've learned why. Republican senators aren't in blue states where this matters. Mike Lawler is. Your former colleague talked to us about this on Wednesday because the position of the SALT caucus is over my dead body, right? I'm a no vote, not a dime less. Here's Mike Lawler on Bloomberg.
The Senate needs to recognize they can make changes, they can enter into negotiations, but the fact is you need 218 votes to pass this in the House, and there is not a chance in hell that this bill will pass at $10,000, let alone less than $40,000. I guess people, want to try and call our bluff. They tried that in the House. They tried to jam us, and we didn't fold.
Not a chance in hell. This has turned out to be one of the most influential groups in the House because Donald Trump can't primary Representative Lawler with a MAGA candidate, can he?
Well, also, these candidates can't go back and campaign as a Republican, that they raise their constituents' taxes, which is effectively what this is.
But if he votes no on the bill, he will raise
Well, no,
taxes.
But if he votes no on the bill, there is no bill that goes to the president's desk.
Therefore, Trump tax cuts expire and everyone gets a hike, though.
Well, but this is also June. We're still in the month of June. There's a lot of runway here before now and the end of the year.
Okay.
The president wants this bill as quickly as possible to his desk. The end of July has been sort of the natural deadline. July 4th is what the White House is saying.
Yes.
I think if you see the Senate pass this bill by this time next week, or they're in the final landing path for the final vote on this by this time next week, the House will be kept into session. It will be kept in session by President Trump and Speaker Johnson, and the demand will be to take it up and pass it to the president's desk.
They'll be voting on July 3rd.
Which means I think the Senate will come to a compromise that the SALT caucus will agree to.
Okay.
That is above $10,000. It may not be perfectly $40,000. It may not be every stitch of the policy of the House.
Yeah.
But the Senate will have to come to terms to fix the House's problem if the president's going to get a bill to the desk before July
What happens
4th.
in the meantime to the Ron Johnsons, Rand Pauls? Does the president write them off? He can lose a couple, right?
You can lose a couple, but Rand Paul's taken himself out of the game. He says it will not vote for it because it includes the debt ceiling increase. He's out. But there's still a pathway without Ron Johnson that means you actually have a deficit reduction package and a clean tax extension. There's a lot of wiggle room that all these senators are providing for themselves, save Rand Paul. And I think you're going to see policymakers try to move these policies to a sufficient happy point for them that they can vote for it. They want to be for this. They do not want to stand in favor of a tax increase.
Sure.
And there's a lot of pressure that the president is bringing to bear.
I want to ask you about crypto because he could put some pressure on House members on this too, right? The Genius Act. I've thought about you when that passed. I wondered what you were thinking because that was a pretty big deal. And with all the noise about Iran and everything happening, which is clearly critical and very important, it might not have gotten the coverage that it deserved. But I'll tell you what, we sat here in this very room on the same program, talked to Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Also Brooks, two Democrats who have very different takes on this. Senator Also Brooks is trying to make the case for crypto that it is about more than criminals. Will the Elizabeth Warrens in the House accept that argument?
No, I think what you're talking about is a serious policymaker who's new to the Senate and somebody who has created an avenue to be a gadfly on policy rather than a participant in policymaking. And so the substantive issue here is that we have, for things that are called a stable coin, no federal definition of what that is, only state regulation of stable coins. We have no requirement for us to have audited financials, no federal oversight of this substantial product that is really rising in use and utility, with hundreds of billions of dollars of flow through stable coins now, and no federal regulatory regime. So you would think that the party that favors more regulation generally, the Democratic Party, would say we need to have some say here. You had 68 votes in the Senate to pass the Genius Act to provide a federal regulatory perimeter on things called stablecoins. It's a simple bill, frankly, that we passed out of committee 2 years ago, at this time out of the House of Representatives.
Is the fear that Donald Trump runs wild making money on crypto, it doesn't crack down on Trump enough, or is the fear that this unlocks the Clarity Act, the new fit bill that brings us to bear when it comes to Bitcoin?
I think you have partisan Democratic senators and in the House
who in some cases previously approved of this legislation.
Yes, and the optics around President Trump's family being engaged in crypto has told them that they're out, and it's really a hot button political issue that they don't want to touch. Mm-hmm. These bills address those issues. The question of public office holders owning crypto can be addressed separately in regulation and legislation. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't stop a 1933 and 1934 Securities and Securities Exchange Act type of legislation for crypto to take hold. It shouldn't stop us regulating financial products at the federal level because you see what Democratic members see as bad actors within the Trump family on this stuff. That shouldn't inhibit legislation. But it did pull some senators off or give them justification to be a no because they're already anti-crypto. The big news here, though, is it is a major bipartisan milestone for the Senate to take up crypto legislation, number one. Mm-hmm. And number two, the Senate Banking Committee has produced now its second piece of major legislation since the financial crisis. Well, yeah. Since Dodd-Frank, the Senate Banking Committee has passed Senate Bill 2155, which was a revision to Dodd-Frank, modest in nature, that became law, and now stablecoins. They've done two major things since Dodd-Frank passage. I think that we should herald because it's serious policymaking, a serious undertaking from a serious committee, and we should welcome that as a functioning piece of government and commend everybody who wanted to participate and to get to a good outcome.
Well, it did take Democrats to pass it in the Senate. We'll see what happens on the House side. I want to ask you about Iran in our remaining couple of moments here because the president's facing a major decision, and you've been involved or were in your time as a member of Congress in debates around authorizing use of force. Mm-hmm. In some cases, they were bent into pretzels to keep them working in places like Iran and Afghanistan. At what point will Congress need to have a say in something if the president decides to take action?
Well, it depends how significant the action is.
This is 30 to 60 days typically. Is there more to it than that?
It is, and it depends how lasting this action is. If you're talking about regime change, I think that is a significant shaker. That's why you see skepticism on MAGA loyalists that want us pulling back from the world. Mm-hmm. And they're saying, do not get into the question of regime change. We saw what happened in Iraq. We need to learn our lessons. Now, the question is, what are those measures that we can take to stop Iran's nuclear program? Mm-hmm. Can we be of aid and assistance to Israel, like it appears that we currently are? Yeah. Should we ramp that up a degree or 50 degrees, depending on your perspective? There is a divide among President Trump's loyalists on this, on what is the right approach. I think what we're going to see here is a Trump doctrine that comes as a result of that, that is neither isolationist nor fully engaged in the international community.
Fascinating. You think we find out in less than 2 weeks?
I think we find out within days.
Fascinating. Always great to see you. Patrick McHenry, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, a man who's held the gavel as former Speaker Pro Tem. Great to see you. Thank you so much, as always. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We'll meet you back here on the 5 p.m. late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.